And we are live with an amazing guest today. I have my friend Kelly Teemer here with us, and we're going to be breaking it down. We're going to be talking all about book PR, baby. We're going to be talking about marketing your book, launching your book, getting PR for the book, what types of PR, and all the good things. All right, Kelly's got a wealth of knowledge, and you know what? I'm going to bring her in right now. So, Kelly, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Jake.
Of course, of course. So, look, you've done a lot in the PR space. You've worked with 200 plus authors. You've been around for some big names. You've been around for some established names. You've been around for some new names. Start me off and start our audience off with a little background of like why the heck you're in book PR.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. So, in college, I studied communications and journalism. Directly after college, I got a job as a news producer at a local CBS affiliate, and then moved away from traditional journalism into public relations for e-commerce. Then subsequently got hired by a hybrid publisher and had spent the last 5 years working to market and publicize books in that capacity. And now I am running my own consultancy doing just that.
I love it. I love it. So talk me through this. Okay, let's go at a really core level, right? Like PR. People interpret PR as a million different things, right? What is PR and what are the different types of PR that we as authors should be aspiring to go after?
Great question. Thank you so much for asking that. So, public relations can be defined a lot of different ways, but in its essence, the core idea is getting your idea and your knowledge out there into the world through various capacities and channels. So, when we think of PR traditionally, I typically hear things like getting placements in magazines, looking at national broadcast shows, radio, local TV. All of those channels are really valuable. But if I were to say that there is one channel that is most important to an author and the release of their book is what we are doing right now is podcasts.
Okay. So there it seems like and this is what I've experienced. There's like traditional PR and then like new age PR, right? And traditional PR encompasses the Foxes, the NBCs, the Good Morning America, the Today Show, the all of the things that we've all grown up and heard. But those aren't really what's driving sales as much as they used to. And those aren't the things that are getting like your exact audience, right? It's a broad scope, not a narrow scope. And the new age is more around the very clear niche specific podcast, speaking on stage type of things. Walk me through this though, because is there still value in getting featured and being able to say, I'm featured in Forbes or ABC or NBC? Like, is that still valuable from a credibility standpoint? And if so, do you just need to do it once or should you be doing it more than once? And then we'll talk podcasts.
Definitely. So absolutely, to answer your question, there is 100% still value in getting into those larger, more recognizable places, what I like to call logo placements, right?
Cool.
Where you can say that, as you spoke about, I've been featured in Forbes, ABC, Fox. The difference is, though, we're operating on a 24-hour news cycle these days, right? So you do one interview and it's great that you're featured. That's fantastic. You're going to get everybody excited about it. But then that's over the next day as the news cycle changes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I like to think about when it comes to traditional PR placements in that capacity is I live by the 80-20 rule. 20% of the value of that placement is the placement itself. You were on Good Morning America or the Today Show. 80% is about how you're going to use that placement, especially for authors who are looking to get more speaking opportunities
Yep.
or perhaps looking for more consulting opportunities or coaching. It's about utilizing those placements through social media, perhaps your email newsletter, to drive that credibility and further that consideration to select you for that opportunity.
Mm. Okay, so we get the placement. Do we need to then constantly be trying to do this, or is there a singular way where you can kind of check off all those boxes to be featured by them, but not spend a ton of money or time trying to chase the 24-hour cycle versus spending your time where you can actually drive more results?
Yeah, so I think getting at least one top tier feature is enough in terms of a book's release and getting the publicity surrounding it. One is great because you'll have that recognizable logo behind it. Of course, getting more is always better because you can tout those titles as well. But at least having one credible place to be able to feature you is usually enough.
Okay, perfect. So let's talk about the PR that drives the real results right now. And this comes from you've worked with people, you mentioned the last 5 years, you've worked with several hundred authors, you now run your own consultancy doing this exact thing, getting people results. And I just want to preface as we go into like this next, the new age PR is what we'll call it for right now, or at least I'm going to call it that because that's what makes sense to me. What I would love to know though is, the authors you've worked with, did some of them come as the book to launch their brand? Did some of them already have brands? Was there a range of authors that you've worked with from new author to established author and, working on their third book? Like, does this work for everybody regardless of their audience at the time of release?
Yeah. So to your point, I have worked with a gambit of authors in that spectrum. So I have worked with people who have a huge existing platform already and they're writing their first book. I've worked with people who want to write a book to build an audience. I've worked with people who are releasing their third book and they're somewhere in between and looking to gain more of a community. So there's been definitely different stages in that capacity.
I love it. So let's dig into the podcast. You're pretty hyped on podcasts. Walk me through, a couple of the benefits that you're seeing, and then let's get into some of the tactical around like, okay, this is cool, but how do we do it? So what are some of the benefits that you've noticed from podcasting, and why do you prefer authors to spend time getting booked on podcasts?
Yeah, definitely. So coming back to the analogy that I talked about the 24-hour news cycle. A podcast is an opportunity that lives in perpetuity on the internet.
Yeah.
So it will help with your SEO and discoverability. It's an evergreen opportunity that provides you with content to share and then repurpose later.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of podcasts also give the opportunity to have links in the show notes that give the opportunity to drive traffic to either your website or your book page or your consulting, whatever that might be. And so you have that benefit, but at the same time, podcasts are typically a bit more of a niche audience. And you've heard that saying, there are the riches and the niches, and you're going to be hitting up a very engaged and fanatical audience that is hungry for your ideas.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And just so you know, I'm a huge podcast person. Like I love podcasts. I think podcasts are awesome. I recently, and this is a great example, I did a podcast in 2021. This is now 2023 at the time we're recording this. I wasn't even really in the book space, but somebody had listened to me talk about my new book that I had just written. Now I'm in the book space. He reached out and said, "Hey, I want to work with you because I liked your style from this podcast that I just heard from 2 years ago." And I was like, that's what I'm talking about, So what you're talking about lives in perpetuity. People can see it. The fanatical audience, all of those things are very, very true. Because sometimes for people, it's just hard to realize that. They're like, oh, I did this podcast, there were 10 listeners or whatever. Like, no one's ever gonna hire me. And it's like, well, no, there's 10 listeners today. Maybe someone will do it. They might refer you to someone who needs what you have to offer on that particular topic. Or 2 years from now, that person's audience skyrockets. And now you're still one of the first episodes. And everyone goes back to look at the first few episodes. So I'd love some of those benefits that you're talking about. And I'd love to, Kelly, go in a little further here. For the people that want to get on more podcasts, right? Like, how do you do it? And how do you make sure should you just get on any podcast when you're releasing a book? Should you have requirements? What's kind of like your frame of thought on that?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm totally with you in terms of podcasts and your experience. The key there is that you never know who might be listening
Mm-hmm.
and when they might be listening. Somebody that has 10 followers today may have 200,000 within a year. And so there's the opportunity for discoverability from that perspective. And so it's great to hear that. It's so nice to be able to have that to leverage your thought leadership and your credibility even more. So I'm really glad to hear that that happened for you. With respect to getting on podcasts for authors. So what I like to think about is we're not necessarily talking about your ideas just to talk about them. We're talking about them so that you're able to help other people, right? They need your ideas more than you need your ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So my recommendation is to find the podcasts that are within your defined target audience and making sure that the messaging and the criteria and the topics that they talk about are aligned with what you are trying to say and what their audience is hungry to hear about. Mm-hmm. So in terms of releasing any kind of book, I don't recommend blasting yourself out to every single podcast. It makes a lot more sense to be more targeted in your efforts and finding the right ones to get that audience engaged with you.
I like that. Okay. So let me ask this question, because if anyone's listening to this, they're like, okay, I get it. Podcasts. Like I'm doing them now. Like I'm sold. Like I need to be on it. Right. And it's also the point you just made, right, is directly the difference between traditional PR, right? You're kind of getting on a show that has every audience versus let's focus on the targeted audience of your book topic who needs what your ideas are, as you just said. So let's talk about this though, because it's like, oh yeah, I should get on podcasts. Well, should you get on podcasts before the book comes out? Should you get on podcasts after the book comes out? Let's keep it simple for now. When should you start trying to be on podcasts?
Definitely. So I think that really breaks down onto the author's goal, right? Okay. If they're looking to build more consultancy before the book releases, then I would say, yes, let's make sure that you do start touting that you have a book coming out and getting audiences engaged ahead of time. I personally like to start reaching out when I have a finalized book available, because the first question I get every time, Jake, is, can I have a copy of the book? And you don't want to send something that isn't complete and finished at that point. Mm-hmm. So that is typically how I like to operate. If you already have a book or you are already a very established thought leader, and you're just looking to build your personal brand or executive presence even more so, there's no harm in reaching out. But the closer that you are to being able to point to your book page, wherever that might be, the better it is in terms of being able to get more book sales, more eyeballs on the book itself. In terms of after the book is released, absolutely, yes, you should be continuing to get yourself booked on podcasts, in my opinion, for the next 18 months since your book's release.
Okay, we need to talk about that. That's some good stuff right there. There's something that you said though related to the podcasting, and you said the number one question you get is, oh, can I have a copy of the book? Do you encourage authors to actually gift a copy of the book in their pitch, whether it be the PDF, whether it be the free Kindle version, depending on how your distribution is and where in the process you are? Or do you recommend on waiting for them to ask for it before giving it? What's kind of your viewpoint on giving the book in the pitch versus waiting?
Absolutely. So that's a great question. I am actually not a fan of adding your book immediately into the pitch. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, you want to make sure that there is mutual interest here, right? You want to make sure that everything is a good fit. Once that's established, of course, send the copy of the book. But if you just go outright and send a PDF file, they didn't ask for that yet, right? And so it can come across as a little bit too salesy, and you want to avoid that. This is more about building a long-term relationship and building a community than just saying, here's my book, read it, please, and interview me. Right.
Okay, now what about this? You're on podcasts, you're like, okay, my book's coming out. Let's just say my book's coming out January 1. And you're like, I want to do more podcasts. Do you encourage people to do podcasts and have them come out leading up to the launch? Like, November, they're starting to do it. And in the podcast, they're like, my book comes out January 1. December, my book comes out January 1. And those episodes are being released in advance? Or do you kind of encourage people to pre-record them, but have them come out during launch week so that you're kind of feeling like you're everywhere and anywhere and you're sharing all these stories? Do you have a preference?
Yeah, I definitely do. So I think there's a lot of value in terms of pre-recording podcast interviews ahead of time. But if possible, and now every single podcaster has their own content schedule and methods of creation. And so they might not be able to line up a release during your launch week, but around there would be great. That way that you have the opportunity for anybody who's listening to actually go and discover your book and purchase a copy of it. So I'm a big proponent of that.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that. Like I did this for my third book, and I was like, okay, one of the big things I want to do is a bunch of podcasts. And so every podcast I recorded, I said, hey, can you have it be released on this day or on this week? And for those that were able to, and I asked this at the beginning before we recorded, because if they said yes, we had to talk as if it was presently launch week, right? And that's an important thing to note is you got to ask this in advance. If they said no, or they said it'll come out, we're 2 months ahead anyways, so it'll be out plenty of time, you can already talk as is. The other thing that's really interesting here is like, one of the things that is great is if you're doing this for a launch strategy, it's awesome to direct them to, hey, my book's anywhere books are sold, and try to, help your ranking and get that initial momentum. But there's also a lot of value is once the book's launched, if you're running a free plus shipping funnel, or you're distributing your book for free, depending on your marketing tactics and your end game goals, that becomes your call to action in it. And so anything after your initial launch can be really about, hey, go get a free copy here, or buy it on Amazon if that's your plan, or hey, you can get the book for free, just cover shipping. Like there are so many different ways to do it. Do you find that authors tend to, with PR, focus way too much on the initial launch versus that 18-month period that you just mentioned? And they're like, well, no one's talking about my book. And it's like, well, you're not talking about your book. So do you find that authors spend too much time only preparing for launch PR versus lifetime PR, essentially?
I do. I have run into those situations before where authors will put an immense amount of pressure upon themselves when this should be a fun part of the journey to get as many appearances as possible, and having them released during launch week and getting as much exposure as possible during that time. I personally like to caution against that. And the reason being is that market can get very oversaturated very quickly. It's going to behoove you much more to have a cadence in terms of episodes that are dropping and points of exposure, rather than having a big bang at once and then that's it for a couple months. It makes a lot more sense strategy wise to have things dropping every 2 weeks to a month, so that there's fresh content, new episodes, new ideas coming out, and you're not oversaturating your social feed with, here's another podcast I was on, here's another thing I was on.
Yeah. With that, how many podcasts, and I know this probably differs depending on the author, their existing audience, etc., but do you have like a goal amount of podcasts? Because a lot of these people are busy too, right? So do you have a recommended amount of podcasts people should be on every week or every month to help them stay top of mind and to do like a successful podcast PR strategy?
Yeah. So I would say being able to work it out in a way that you have a podcast dropping at least every month. So that'll keep everyone top of mind. You're still producing content. Your book is still relevant and topical and being talked about, I think is ideal. 2 weeks in between each episode that you are able to book, produce, and share is fine. But any more than that is going to risk that oversaturation point.
Okay. So and I just want to make sure, like, if you want to go on the high end, like about 1-2 podcasts a month coming out, you can share it with your audience fully without worrying about oversaturating your feed or anything like that. If you got more, you just don't need to share every single podcast that you're on, because then people are just going to think you're just only talking about all the shows you've been on, right? But it sounds like you're saying about 2 podcasts per month, one at the minimum. And do you recommend like just consistently trying to put in your calendar, like, okay, I'm going to record 2 podcasts a month. So I need to pitch myself to 6. If I have a 33% conversion rate, I just need to do 1 day a week where I pitch, or I need to just hire you because you'll do that for me and just make sure that I have 2 podcasts. Like, what's the analytics behind it, or what's the easiest way for an author who's running a business, but now they have this book and they really want to utilize it, but time is their constraint?
Sure, absolutely. And I worked with a ton of busy executives who are on time constraints, and it's tough to do so. So you have to think about your book launch and your publicity strategy as a long-term thing. So again, with the analogies of how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time, right?
Yeah.
I find that a lot of people are most successful in these strategies if they create and stick to a very regimented routine. So call it Tuesday morning, you block your entire morning up until lunchtime to find 20 podcasts that you would really love to be on. Kind of dive into what they're covering right now, what they've recently covered, start formulating your pitches, and then sending those out. And just making that a weekly practice so that long-term you're making progress, but it isn't so quite daunting given the sheer amount of podcasts that are out there.
Do you have any like pitch tips or like organization tips to like best use that like Tuesday morning time slot that we just talked about?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of using spreadsheets, right? So there's a lot of great software out there that can help you discover podcasts. I personally use Podchaser to be able to take a look at certain titles, certain genres, things like that. And so taking a look at some of the more popular episodes or podcasts that are happening within that vertical, making a list, and then doing maybe a 20-minute deep dive on what they've been covering lately and what's been interesting and what has been said recently that hasn't been covered but is your idea, right? And then from there starting to create a compelling pitch marrying those two efforts.
Okay. I'm gonna nerd out here for a little second. When you've obviously worked with so many people and have probably seen and done thousands and thousands of pitches over on podcasts. Do you find, and let me there's 3 levels here, okay? So let me try to articulate this, but I'm gonna geek out here. There's I'm gonna go through 20 minutes. I'm gonna listen to a podcast episode of this person I've never heard of, but I'm really getting deep into it so I can have full customization and really curate the perfect pitch, right? That takes you about 20 plus minutes, right? The other one is you kind of just do a quick 5-minute look through and you say, okay, I know they're talking about this, this, and this. I know these 3 people who they interviewed or whatever. You can quickly customize a pitch, but it's not as personal. And then there's the third one, which is like spray and pray, volume game over everything. Have you found like a massive difference in each of those levels? Or is there like one that's the best bang for your buck? Or time,
Yeah, great question. And so appreciate you asking. I am 100% against a spray and pray methodology. Because podcasters also want to know that you're taking the time to listen to them and understand their audience and understand their messaging. And if you're just saying, hey, I'm an expert in this and this and this, and I know you covered business, and so I want to be on your show. And they're like, well, but I'm talking about this specific part of it. So I'm not a big fan of that. And then at the same time, I'm also not a huge fan of getting too custom because you want to make sure that you're still applying your principles and your elements to what's relevant to them. So
right.
To your point, I think the middle approach is really great. And a couple tips that I would definitely recommend is keeping your pitch as short as possible while still conveying your ideas. So I've looked at pitches in the past that are essentially a very small novel and a lot of information. And in today's scrolling age, it's like too long, didn't read, not going to read this later. So being able to put together bullet points of why you're the expert to talk about this. If you have any endorsements from some more high profile people or a connection to a guest that they have previously interviewed. That's really kind of the money-making aspect of that, because you have that shared connection and ability that way.
Okay, I like this a lot. So let me play a little game here, because people pitch me to be on the show a fair amount. Not more than any huge podcast. I'm not going to try to say I get hundreds of these requests all the time, but people do pitch to be on the show, and it's getting more and more and more. And so I have to be selective. We only have a limited amount of spots, and I'm very clear on who I want and what type of vibe I want. I'm also very clear that I love pitching and getting on. I love when people pitch. But when people pitch me something really long, I'm out. I'm like, that's great, but no. Second thing is, it's very easy to get past the gatekeeper if you know what to do. So a lot of people that host podcasts, and the bigger the podcast, the bigger the person, the more requests they're constantly getting. And so oftentimes there's a gatekeeper. That could be an assistant, a podcast manager, whatever it is, right? What I have found is that as someone who receives it, the easiest way to get past the gatekeeper is to create some form of that initial personal connection that makes the gatekeeper question if they actually know you or not. Because then they're like, wait, I have to bring this to them. I can't make this decision on my own. And then the third thing that I've noticed here, and this goes directly to your point, is when someone pitches me and they're like, hey, I listened to this episode with X person and I just like loved this. Let's go. Like, cause I say, let's go all the time. I'm like, okay, you already broke through the noise. All I need after that is for you to tell me like who you are and what value you're going to add. I don't need to know anything else, because if I'm interested, the first thing I'm doing is looking up who you are. Are you legit? Do I like what I'm seeing? Do you have a brand? Do I think you're an expert on the topic that you claim to be an expert on? That's what I'm looking for. And so, like you said, I don't want a really long thing. I just want a custom sentence. I want a who am I? And I want to, or like, who are you, the pitcher? And then I want literally just like, here's how I can add value into the show. This is the topic that I think would be great. Here are a couple ideas. That's all I need. What do you think? Like what do you notice works really well?
I completely agree with you. So I think the more attention and the more custom that you can make your pitch, and being able to really have that touch point with the podcaster or even anything outside of that media, the more custom and specific to show that you're paying attention, that you're a fan, that you really love the content, you firmly believe that you'll be able to add value, is so pivotal and so crucial to be able to get yourself booked on those kind of things. I completely agree with your discernment in terms of bringing guests on, because you want to make sure that they're really engaged and they're going to be bringing the best interview and the most value they can.
Okay. All right. I think I want to kind of recap as we get into kind of like the ending part of this. Is like, we've talked about a lot. You've given some incredible information around the quantity of podcasts you should be doing, the time of podcasts you should be doing, how to do podcasts, why podcast differs than traditional media. I mean, we've talked about a lot. There's a lot of things that people can take around. The last like kind of core topic that I'd love to talk about is this, like the pay to play space, the pay to play, because there are podcasts, and for people that don't know, pay to play is, there are podcasts that if you try to reach out, you'll never get on them. But if you pay a fee, you can secretly get on these shows. And sometimes they'll be telling you, hey, this is an advertisement. Sometimes it's not. My question to you is, as someone who helps authors build their brand, do you believe in the pay to play method of podcasting? And do you find that it's better to be on a few big ones versus a bunch of smaller ones? What's your thoughts on the pay to play model?
Yeah, great question. And it's funny, Jake, I'm starting to see a lot more of that coming out there because, podcasters are smart people and they know that they can monetize this product that they're offering. So my thoughts are, the first thing I would like to do, if I pitch an author out and they say, okay, yes, but it's this amount of money, the first thing I'm going to take a look at is a quick recap of everything that they've been covering recently. Is the content there? Is the match there? The second thing I'm going to ask is, how many people are they reaching per month? So I don't want somebody paying $500 to appear on a podcast that's going to reach 250 people. I don't care how engaged their audience is. It's just not worth the time and money. I like to err on the side of purely organic and earned media, unless I look into my dashboard and the software that I use and see, you know what, this really is a good opportunity and could open a lot of doors for you. And I do think that you should pursue it. And I'll always give that advice and discernment to say, you know, your dollars and time are valuable. And so we want to make sure that you're getting on the best opportunity. So it's not a no, it's just is it the right fit to do so?
I like that. Do you have like, and you're mentioning the dashboard and some of the secret analytics, right? Are there, and I don't want you to reveal all your secrets, but like, are there softwares out there that allow people to see like actual monthly listeners or like details that you would never find just publicly searching somebody's podcast on iTunes or Spotify?
Yeah, absolutely. There are tools out there that you can purchase from a subscription standpoint that are able to provide contact information, a little bit more on the demographics of who's listening, down to age and gender and income level, education. You can get pretty granular with them. But if you don't want to invest in things like that, the number one thing I would take a look at if you were just looking at a podcast blind is the number of reviews that they have.
Interesting. That makes sense. I mean, reviews are always social proof. It's always funny to me though, the review thing, not on podcasts, because I think that's pretty straightforward. Like you're not really using your podcast in other ways. But like when I think of like books, like my books don't have a crazy amount of reviews, but we move hundreds and thousands of copies of my book behind the scenes. But there is that perception, right? When you go on Yelp for a restaurant, the reviews, it catches your attention. So I love how you bring that up because I think it's so important. We just got to remember, like, we're all humans, right? And like at the end of the day, like we're smart. We'll figure it out. And to kind of full circle here is like, you know, you talk about all these softwares, you talk about all these things to pitch. Like, how do you actually work with people? Because someone listening to this might be like, shit, this is all great. I don't want to do this myself. So like, how do people actually work with you? And then also like, let us know how we can connect with you and continue to follow your journey.
Sure, definitely. So if I have an author who has, let's call it again, a business book, right? So I would read the book and take a look at some of the messaging here. And let's say it's a book on leadership, for example. Well, there's a lot of different verticals that you can take that into, right? So we can talk business, leadership, C-suite, even going into HR and company culture. And so I like to kind of dice it up by verticals and seeing where we can fit these into our overall pitch plans and adjusting the messaging to each vertical that we're talking to make sure that we're saying really relevant information. So that's been my approach so far.
Awesome. And then do you work with people in monthly contracts, yearly contracts? Do you consider yourself a publicist? Like how specific is it when it comes to working with you on your PR services?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for asking. So I work on a monthly retainer with a minimum 3-month commitment. And so, yeah. And so I say 3 months because 3 months of work together is really where you're going to start seeing a lot of traction happening. There's a lot of groundwork that goes into it in terms of developing the messaging points, putting together a media kit when people are asking about the author and how they can learn more. A lot of discernment in terms of pulling the appropriate media contact information, both from the relationships that I have through, thousands of podcasters at this point, but also looking at places that maybe are new or I don't know specifically. So that's kind of how that works.
Awesome. I love it. So how do we connect with you? How do we follow you on social? Would love for you to let us all know where we can go after the show.
Yeah. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I am very active on there in terms of engaging with people. I'm starting to put together more content myself, but I've checked LinkedIn multiple times a day. And so you can find me there.
Awesome. And we'll link that up for in the show notes. But I just want to say, Kelly, thanks for coming on the show. You clearly know your shit because I have some deep questions and you know your shit. And that's what we love over here at the Big Idea to Bestseller podcast. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Jake. It was such a pleasure to be here.
Of course. And for all of you that just listened to this, here's my challenge to you. Obviously, if you enjoyed listening to Kelly, talk to her. She's awesome. Go connect with her on LinkedIn. But here's my ultimate challenge to you. We got deep in the world of podcasting today. We talked about a lot of the benefits of it. We talked about why you need to be on podcast. Not why you should, but why you need to be on podcast as a soon to be released author or as an already existing published author. So my challenge to you is go get yourself booked on a podcast between now and next week. Whenever you listen to this, go get yourself booked on a podcast and get that commitment. So thank you again, Kelly, and thank you to you for listening to this because we lit it up today. So I'll see you all on the next one.